starting a series on worship, and it's going to be this Sunday and next Sunday. We're going to take a little bit of time to just talk about what worship is, and really the big theme for the next couple of weeks is looking at what does the Bible teach us about how we worship. And then how does that inform, how does that shape how we worship and the patterns of worship that we have today, both in our own lives and then also as a church. That there's this corporate or community aspect to worship. There's this aspect of worship that we do together as a church. But there's also this very deep sense in which worship is a personal thing. It's a personal response to God. It's personal action. What we're going to do is kind of structure it so that we talk about both this corporate, communal, community sense of worship, but then also about what it is to do personal worship and to think about worship as a personal response to God. So if you look at a definition of worship, you really get that sense. It's both corporate, it's this community, but it's also a very personal act. So this first definition of worship, the feeling or expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. A feeling or an expression of reverence and adoration for a deity. But it is also the acts or rites that make up a formal expression of reverence for a deity or a religious ceremony. Is another way to think about that. And I think in our church we're probably really familiar with this idea of the coming together as a church, this corporate worship, where we start every Sunday and we have this 30-minute block of time for worship. And so this morning, in my part, I'm going to kind of go through 4 different stages of the Old Testament and highlight 4 different elements to worship that we see in kind of the corporate side. And the first one goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. It goes all the way back to the creation account in the book of Genesis. And I don't know if you have really thought much about the story of creation, the account of creation in the Bible, and tied that with worship. So when God created everything, we see that He creates by His word. He creates, there's creativity, there's power, there's strength to what He does. Well, what does that tell us about worship? It tells us a couple of really foundational things. It tells us why we worship. We see that God is able to speak life in such a way that it overcomes darkness, it overcomes chaos, it overcomes everything that is associated with darkness and chaos. It brings peace and it brings order. And that motivates us to worship Him. So that's a fundamental reason of why we worship God. Why do we worship God? Because He is our Creator. He has created us. He has made us. And we are hardwired to worship our Creator. But Genesis 1 and 2 also show us some ways in which we can worship God. Some real kind of fundamental aspects about who God is. And the first is that God's presence is focused in greater measure in certain locations on the earth. And that has been set in motion from the very beginning, from this story of Adam and Eve in the garden. That though God is everywhere, there are places where He is more fully present. Second, God's relationship with humanity is unique. Where Adam and Eve were able to talk with God, to walk with Him, there was nothing that separated humanity and God. This in some ways is the ideal picture of worship, where there is no barrier between humanity and God. And third, there's a deeply close an intimate relationship. It's this absolute picture of humanity in peace with God. Humanity is absolutely at peace with God and in His presence. There is closeness and harmony. And all of these things go together. Because we're made in God's image, we have deep and intimate relationship with God, and His presence is more fully focused and realized where humanity and God are in the same place. And so there's this deepness that kind of occurs as we look at what is worship from Genesis 1 and 2, from this creation account. The Hebrew word for worship is the same word that is used for work. As a result of the fall of humanity, their willful disobedience of Adam and Eve, this picture of harmony, of closeness, of even work itself was completely and utterly destroyed. So that's the first phase in this whole idea of looking at worship in the Old Testament. The second phase is Moses and the tabernacle and the law and all of that. Moses is leading the people of Israel. They've come out of bondage and slavery in Egypt, and God is leading them into freedom. I don't know if you remember, but when Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh, What was the reason given that they needed to leave? It was that they would go and worship God. So God is forming this nation, this young nation of Israel, as they wander in the desert. He's forming and shaping them to be a nation that lives in conformity to His will. And one of the main ways that He does that is through establishing a law that included patterns of worship. One of the biggest problems with this part of the scriptures is that this closeness of God's presence with His people no longer exists. There's no place on the earth that you can point to and say, this is where God's really focused presence exists. This is the first step in God establishing that He is going to come and be with His people. And so God had to have somewhere established for His presence to return. And that place was the tabernacle. And it's not just the fact that you could just rush into God's presence. In fact, only one person could go into God's presence. And God's presence was in the most holy place. God's holiness is emphasized. Going into the presence of God to worship Him was a terrifying ordeal. They didn't know if the high priest would make it out alive. It also teaches us that we cannot come into God's presence on our own terms. We must come into His presence on His terms.
Amen.
We approach God on His terms. And this is the first step of God coming back and establishing His closeness relationship with His people. And worship looked like a very formal pattern. There was lots of national holidays where the people would stop their work and they would go and give thanks to God, where there'd be atonement for sin and the sacrifice of animals and a lot of bloodshed and a lot of ceremony and a lot of formality. And as we transition into the third element, which is looking at David, King David, we see that the same pattern of worship exists where there's sacrifice. The tabernacle, this tent of meeting where God would come, His presence would come, where all of these sacrifices would take place. God is still in the tabernacle during the time of David. When David brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, it is still put in a tent. But in the time of David, it starts to become even larger. The patterns of worship are expanding, where there's more creativity in terms of worship and song, where there's more music, where there's more just greater numbers of priests that are serving God. You see that during this time, the book of Psalms comes into being, and we have that in our Old Testament, these psalms, these songs of praise that are being used as the people worship together. Worship is very elaborate. Worship is increasing in how elaborate it is. It's increasing in creativity. It's increasing in the use of music. Another major theme that you see is that God is worshipped not just as the God of Israel, but as the God who is the one true God of all nations. Got this element where it's focused on other people, and worship must spill over to other nations. Worship must extend beyond just God's people and must be for the other nations. Going into our final period in the Old Testament, looking at worship this morning, is the time of Solomon. There was a problem in the time of David, and that was David had settled in the city of Jerusalem and made that the capital city of his reign. And he was living in this really nice palace, and God was living next door in this tent. And David felt that problem deeply in his heart, and he said, God, I want a temple to be built for you. And God said, I would rather live in a temple, but you cannot build it for me. Instead, your son will build it. And yet God gave all of the directions for building this temple to David. David passed this mantle on to his son, King Solomon, and Solomon builds this magnificent temple for God. It was huge, there was gold everywhere, and there was just permanence to it, and it became the center of the life of Israel. It became the center of everything that happened in Jerusalem. The patterns of worship didn't change. There was still all of the law of Moses, still the sacrifice, still the burning of incense, still the Holy of Holies, and you can't just rush into God's presence. All of that stayed. But now we have this magnificent building, this temple for God's presence. And this echoed what had been happening since the time of Moses, when they established the tabernacle and the people would camp in the wilderness. The tabernacle was at the very center of when they would camp. They would put the tabernacle in the middle, and all the tribes would pitch their tent around the tabernacle. It's a picture of everything being oriented around worship, and that pattern continued all the way through and was really seen when the temple was established in Jerusalem. So this teaches us that we should have a place of honoring God As the worship built in the Old Testament, it built from God in a tent in the desert to a temple in Jerusalem. So that's an overview of some of the corporate and national patterns of worship as the people came together to worship together, some ways in which worship developed. But there's also a very personal side to worship. And we see these glimpses, these pictures of what personal worship looks like in the Old Testament.